Hello. So this isn't going to be an ordinary video as far as my channel is concerned. Usually what I do is I go over basic issues of philosophy from a relatively objective standpoint or from an historical standpoint. But given the recent news and the recent debate and discussion about Milo Yiannopolis and his statements about pedophilia, hebophilia, whatever you want to call it, I think there's a critical perspective missing in a lot of the discussion, and I think that I ought to say something about it. So here goes. That the perspective that's critically missing is to do with taking the analysis of sexual ethics, especially with this context, from first principles, rather than taking it from a particularist set of this kind of thing is wrong, this kind of thing is right, and just setting up a sort of deontological framework. And also, I think it's the whole discussion is wandering very far into the realm of in-group versus out-group. I like Milo, so he's an unfortunate victim, versus I don't like Milo, so he's justifying predation. That's obviously not... it may or may not be what's going on, but it's certainly not helpful or illustrative of any kind of point. So before I get more into this perspective, I did notice something about Milo's point of view that has shown up before, but this really drew it to a head, which is it's an historical observation, not anything particularly to do with the ethics involved, but it's, I think, interesting in a sense, maybe just for me. So Milo seems to have stumbled across or landed on, or what have you, on very distinctly the classical Greek view of sex, sexuality, and particularly homosexuality. Now, whether he's particularly aware of this connection or whether this was purely incidental, I have no idea. I haven't seen him say or heard him say anything on the subject, but his views are very closely aligned with the classical Greek view. Particularly what we see in Plato, and in a lot of classical Greek literature, given his comments about older men and younger boys. And of course, in the context, as he has clarified, boy means a young adult, a young man, someone post-pubescent, but sexually mature from a biological standpoint, but sexually naive perhaps from a sociological or psychological standpoint. And this is very much what you see in classical Greek literature, especially. And you'll see this especially if you look at Plato's Symposium. And again, his definition of a boy can come right from that if you look at it. For instance, Alcibiades, who is the manliest young man in all of Greece, he was an Olympic champion, is referred to, at least in most translations, as a boy when it's in the context of him attempting to seduce in a weird, provocative, and turned on its head way, seduce Socrates, the much older man, who's at the time likely in his 50s. So this is a relationship between someone who's in his late teens, maybe early 20s, with someone, or an attempted relationship, I should say, with somebody who's much, much older, several times as many years old. So this is very much what Milo is talking about. Now, again, I'm not yet passing any kind of a judgment on this. I'm not saying that this, because Plato thought it, it's a good thing. Certainly not. I absolutely don't think so, obviously, which I think will become more obvious once I point out a more nuanced view on the subject. But it does have an historical precedent, which is at least interesting from a historical standpoint. Also, something that Milo's view has in common with the ancient Greeks, the classical Greeks, I should say, is that he's said in the past, on several occasions, that he doesn't think lesbianism is a real thing. Lesbians aren't real. His like edgy tagline, which is the idea that same-sex relationships between women are at most transient, generally not something that's settled, and generally not sexual. It's not sex as he would consider it, as between a man and a woman or between two men. And this is precisely the view you find in Greek literature, in classical Greek literature, I should say, because you really won't find any kind of lesbian relationships outside of obvious satire or maybe an occasional notice where it's hinted at. But if it's ever hinted at, it's hinted at as abnormal and very strange and not understood by the greater, especially male cultural milieu. The only place you'll see anything like a lesbian relationship like we would think of today is in, again, the Symposium, where it's part of a very obvious satire put in the mouth of Xenophanes, who is a satirist, a critic, a cultural critic, making fun of things. And again, speaking of Xenophanes, a quote that's usually attributed to Xenophanes, who again was a noted satirist, that really summarizes the Greek view, is that women are for procreation, boys are for recreation, and cantaloupes are for pure pleasure. All of which in the same context as far as sexuality goes. So this is, again, like I said, really similar to, in a way, what Milo has said. So I may come back to this, but again, that's just an historical footnote that's interesting to me because I study these things. It may not be interesting to you. It's certainly not relevant to whether what he said is right or wrong. For that, we need to look to some first principles. So I digress from the historical point. So this kind of a view, this kind of confusion that comes up with respect to at what age or between whom is sexual contact licit, morally acceptable, legally acceptable, or even maybe wholesome, which seems to be what he's arguing in a couple of cases. This is the kind of murkiness and confusion that comes up when the only requirement for sex to be licit, acceptable, or wholesome is consent. Because we all readily admit that there is an age range, generally around puberty, where consent, especially with regards to sex, is ambiguous at best. Can only be ambiguous at best. So again, the waters are already murky in this case, right? When it comes to whether consent can be freely given, and when somebody like Milo Yiannopolis, who's especially known for being intentionally edgy, when he says things like this, it makes those waters just murkier, which is unhelpful when you're analyzing a philosophical or an ethical point. So instead, maybe you'll forgive me for being old-fashioned. I'm an old-fashioned sort of bloke. If we want to look at what's really going on here, if we want to look at whether a particular relationship or a particular sexual encounter is ethical, in a broad sense, we have to keep in mind the context and the teleology, so the teleological end of sex. And you can argue for this from basic first principles, from almost indisputable first principles of metaphysics, and then from some notions of basic philosophical anthropology, but I can't do that here. I may eventually get to this point through philosophical analysis in lectures, but in this video, I don't have the time to do that. So we'll take it for granted that sex does have a goal or an end, and it does have a proper context. So perhaps let's look to particularly the Christian tradition and something like an appeal to authority. Call it illicit if you want, but let's take this perspective, shall we? So within this perspective, sex and sexuality is contextualized within lifelong marriage, and it is for the end, primarily, of procreation. It's also for the end of strengthening that marital bond, but that's always only ever secondary to its end being procreation. That is the biological function of sex. So, from this, we can look at any kind of a relationship and say, okay, does it fit within the potential context of marriage? And does it, at least in potential, have the capacity for procreation? And this is why, this is how we get the Christian view of sex between a man and a woman, an adult man and an adult woman in marriage. This is where this comes from. This is not arbitrary commands, which it may seem like if if sex is only about consent, if that's it, then sure. Heterosexuality, heteronormativity, whatever you want to call it, and marital fidelity may seem arbitrary. If consent is the only deciding factor. But it certainly isn't. If the end is being considered, if the end of procreation is to be considered, and if the context of lifelong marriage, which in part is wholly self-giving, in the sense of love, as in the Greek agape, or the Latin caritas, in either case, right? It's wholly self-giving, and it intrinsically involves sex. Right? So marriage without sex is never considered to be naturally valid. It can still be a contract, it can still be a compact even, but it cannot be the indissoluble bond of marriage, which is considered lifelong, and intrinsically involves sex, and intrinsically involves at least the possibility of procreation and raising children. So this is where we get the idea of what non-normative forms of sexuality are and what makes them wrong. We see here from this understanding that not only is the relationship between a 30-year-old man and a 14-year-old boy wrong, but any other sort of what, again, you'll forgive my old-fashioned language, deviant sexuality does. Because even setting aside the element of homosexuality, which means that it's certainly not open to procreation, right out there, but even, for instance, a relationship between a much older man and a young woman, so a 14-year-old girl. Now, a 14-year-old girl may or may not be capable of bearing a child. That's a medical question, and it differs from person to person. Generally speaking, that is very, very young, dangerously young to carry a child. Although, perhaps, there may be a young woman who is capable of bearing a child, biologically speaking, at the age of 14. Perhaps even to a man who's 30, 40, or 50 years old. However, almost certainly, that 14-year-old girl, or let's even be charitable and say that 14-year-old young woman, is not in a position to marry that 30, 40, 50-year-old man. From a sociological standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, she is not ready to commit to that man and to raising his children for life. You can turn this the other way as well and look at the very typical example, the very common example of young men in their teens having sex with or being molested by, depending on how you want to characterize it. I think the latter is perfectly fair. So being molested by their much older female teachers. This is shockingly common. Of course, those young men are certainly not ready, psychologically and sociologically and economically speaking, not ready to marry that woman. And she is not in a position to marry these young men. And she almost certainly has no intention to do so. So this is why we see this as being a problem, right? It's not merely the case that they cannot consent to the physical act of sexual intimacy, but rather that they are not in a position, sociologically or psychologically, to consent to marriage, which is what sex is intrinsically a part of. So when things are this intrinsically and closely connected to one another, even conceptually separating them one from the other gives rise to these sorts of problems. These sorts of gray areas that should not be gray. We should not have any trouble saying a sexual relationship between a 30-year-old man and a 13-year-old boy is unacceptable. We should have no problem agreeing with that. However, we've happened across what looks like a gray area in what should be pitch black, what should be absolutely forbidden. There's a debate on. This should be perfectly clear. And if we take the position that sex is properly contextualized within lifelong marriage and properly ordered towards procreation, there's no question of the matter. So this is what we should take to be the standard of what makes sex and sexuality wholesome, good, ethical, acceptable. And this is what Christians in general, and the Catholic Church especially, has been saying for millennia. That if one is able to consent to marry and is metaphysically capable of marriage with the other party, then within that context, sex is acceptable. And this is why ages of consent can change. This is why an 18-year-old boy can marry a 16-year-old girl centuries past. Because sociologically speaking, they were capable of supporting a family. Today, that is not the case. That is almost certainly not the case in almost any context. This is why ages of consent can shift at least slightly. Now, not radically. It's still impossible for an 8-year-old girl to procreate with a man or boy of any age. That is, with no exception, unacceptable from this standpoint. And this is also why we see that. This is also why the Catholic Church has always said that contraception is unacceptable. It separates sex from its proper end, its end being procreation. And even, one might argue, separates sex from its secondary end, marital bonding. Because it prevents the two partners from wholly giving of themselves to each other. This is expounded greatly in John Paul II's Theology of the Body. I would highly recommend looking into it. If you're looking into learning more about this perspective, I couldn't recommend it highly enough. But so this is when, and this is why sex, if it's contraceptive, or if it's adulterous, or if it's homosexual, or if it's pedophilic, or hebephilic, if we want to be overly specific, this is why it degenerates into something like mutual masturbation or not mutual masturbation. This is the point at which sex stops being what it is meant to be and becomes something apparent. So I hope I've shed some light on this issue that hasn't been really spoken of in this context. And I'm sad to say that I had to say this. This isn't normally the kind of thing that, like I said, this isn't the normal kind of thing I will do on this channel. But it's a discussion that needed to be had, and it's a method of analysis that needed to be pursued. Because it hasn't been. And it's a particularly grave issue that has not gotten grave enough treatment. So hopefully I've done something positive here. So with that, I will hopefully see you again next time, and I will see you in perhaps a more abstract and contemplative video that isn't so severe and doesn't pertain so directly to such difficult matters. Because I do greatly prefer talking about abstract ideas, abstract philosophical topics. So hopefully I can go back to doing that. So, until next time, see you later.